Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to AMI's mining chat. This week, we are shifting gears on several fronts. First of all, let me introduce myself to those of you who don't know me and are accustomed to seeing Remy Piet leading these meetings. Remy is no longer affiliated with AMI. I am, as managing director of the firm, resuming leadership of the mining practice, which I started in 2008 and ran for a decade before Remy took it on. And today, we are going to, as usual, run a 1-hour mining chat. There is a couple of differences. Number one, I will be inviting you all to pose questions once we get through our first initial list of questions with our guest, Sam Logan, who I'll introduce in a second. And to do that, I would ask that you use the function under participants where you can raise a hand. And at that point, I will signal, I will speak and say your name and ask you to speak your question, which Sam or myself will be pleased to address. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Sam Logan. Sam, as the introductory note that you received alluded to, has had an illustrious career as an investigative journalist in Latin America, as a security expert, and as a due diligence expert, among other things. He wears many hats and works very deeply on investigations, security-related investigations for the mining and other resource sectors, as well as due diligence investigations of the emerging digital commerce space. He is an author. He is a public speaker. He advises not only companies like yourselves, but several three-letter agencies he's advised for the United States government on Latin America affairs. And he's a good friend of mine dating back, I hate to say it, Sam, almost 20 years now. And he is a senior advisor to AMI on security issues. So, Sam, welcome aboard. We appreciate your time today, and I'm sure that those attending will also get a lot out of your insights today.
Yeah, John, happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, one of Sam's fortes is the research of organized crime and how it intercepts with Latin American economic interests, whether it's close to government or whether it's specific industries like mining. And certainly, Sam, you've worked on several mining cases where organized crime was an important part of the threat component to their operations. Where today in Latin America do you identify organized or unorganized crime and criminality as a complicating factor for mining investors?
Yeah, that's a nice opening, broad question. Part of me wants to say, in the entire region, right? And that's partially true because, if we think about the price of commodities as they've gone up, there's a lot more interest from the criminal world, the criminal economy. But to be more specific and maybe move forward with the conversation in a more direct way, the countries that come to mind for me really are, top of the list is going to be Mexico, and then I would move probably to Chile and Peru, followed by Colombia, and then would probably also add Brazil to that for different reasons. But when we talk about organized crime, John, did you also want to frame out this idea that we're not just talking about cartels? Did you want to add in
Certainly.
This element of?
I mean, I think that's very important to define early on. Is that it's at the end of the day, the tactics you use against criminal activity can't be restricted to one brand of that criminality. You have to be cognizant of all threats, right?
Right. So for the benefit of everyone on the call today, and thank you all for joining us, and look forward to hearing from you as well. But John and I sort of had a pregame call, and one of the ideas, one of the thoughts that surfaced in my own experience is when you're thinking about organized crime on the surface of it, oftentimes, the conversation will want to trend towards talking about the, Mexican cartels or gangs or some sort of element of organized crime that is more of a traditional or historical component to the conversation. And while that's true, while we do see that there are larger groups of organized criminals, you think of the Bacrim in Colombia and Venezuela, or you think about the FARC or the ELN in that part of the world. You could also think about, different organized criminal groups that are drug trafficking organizations in Colombia and through Central America. But some of the groups that we found that have caused the most amount of concern and sleepless nights for, the VP of operations for different mines or the head of security or for legal, has nothing to do with any of those guys, but it is organized crime in the sense where you have, as we've seen examples in South America, where you have someone who is the head of a community come together with someone who is a lawyer who may or may not be representing the mining operator, and someone who is oftentimes working for the mine. And those 3 or 4 people come together and they come up with a scheme for how they can essentially extort the mine and the community to a certain extent. So, I thought it would be interesting for today's discussion to sort of broaden that understanding of organized crime beyond a lot of what we see coming out of, YouTube Mexican channels or what maybe more traditional thought about cartels. So.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. And I think the very notion that there's many connected parts to this, whether it's, other threats that are not criminal at first glance, nonetheless have a interest in alignment with criminal groups because they share the same interests, I think is important to note.
Right.
Let's take, without, revealing any confidential details of any of the assignments that we've worked on or you've worked on yourself. Mm-hmm. Can you share some of the tactics that you've seen? Because I think there's nothing like, speaking to the specifics to really open people's eyes to what they might be facing.
Yeah. So there's maybe two. Well, there's two, maybe three, and maybe I'll just start with the two, and then we'll kind of see how the conversation flows. But the tactic that we're most often seeing, and we've seen it in South America and in Mexico, is where you have a mining operator that's sitting on an asset where they have a concession for maybe 15 or 20 years, so they're not going anywhere. There's obviously the communities around them, or to a certain extent, the human capital pool that the mining operator draws from. Part of it may or may not be unionized, but the first tactic is actually not about the community as much as it's about the providers and the companies that are listed with the mine to provide these important services and to supply things like fuel, to supply or conduct explosives, or to supply water, or even food. Sorry, I'm by a street, so you're going to hear a little background noise from other. But we've seen where some operators are more cautious about those suppliers. They conduct a level of annual due diligence checks on those suppliers, and what they're ultimately trying to figure out is the extent to which those suppliers are exposed to a criminal element. And the criminal element could be a local politician who is wanting to extort them for making a facilitation or some other similar interaction. So in short, the first tactic is where you have, in one way or another, a critical provider to the mine has been compromised. And so what that looks like is as I think a lot of people on this call are familiar, it looks like invoices to your mine that are higher than expected. And so that's the first tactic. The second one that we've seen, and this is where there's always an interesting conversation about the love-hate relationships between union leaders and sort of criminal bosses or local toughs. And in different areas, you can see direct competition or direct sort of decision to work together, where you have a community leader who wants the best for his or her community, and you have a union leader who sometimes wants the best for the members of the union, but oftentimes is just part of a larger scheme of moving money up the chain. And where you have the two come together, and you may have a third element, and this is the third tactic I'll mention in a moment, but you have a third element that might come in from an employee of the mine, where they get together and they decide to compromise the workforce in a way that that manipulates and that moves opinion, and where the direct impact on the mine can be is where, you know, the union may decide that it doesn't or isn't interested in conducting a blockade, but there may be a personal interest coming from the union leader and the community leader, where there is either strife between the two, or there is a decision to work together where they want to hold out and they want to cause trouble for the mine specifically, where they decide to blockade the entrance to the mine if it's a one entrance type of asset, or cause other sort of shutdown situation. And if I may, just another couple minutes, John,
Sure.
I'll add the third one. So when we talk to our mining clients, we often ask them, well, you know, what are the things that keep you up at night in terms of causing a shutdown? Because that's probably the single most expensive activity that could come together to cause, you know, a lot of heartache amongst the corporate level or executive level at a mining operation. The other one is, you know, what contributes to a rise in your costs. And so if we think about a gold producing mine, they're saying, okay, well, it costs us maybe $800 per ounce to produce, or maybe it's less, maybe it's more. But the idea is there anything that's happening on the ground here that's going to move us significantly in one way, in one direction or the other? And so the last tactic that I've seen is, and this has happened, I've seen this more often in Mexico really than anywhere else, but the last tactic is where you have an fairly influential individual who works for the mining company. It's usually a person who works for the local subsidiary, not necessarily someone who's flying in from, you know, Denver or Toronto or Vancouver or, you know, or London or Sydney or something, but someone who's working for the local subsidiary who in one way or another has been compromised. And then that person in turn begins opening doors, facilitating access. And so I wouldn't really think of it as much as in the traditional sense of an insider threat. But this is the situation where you may have a security manager, you may have a person who's working at your plant or at a processing plant. You may have someone who's directly involved in transportation. But one way or another, there's some sort of way that these criminal elements are allowed in, and then from there, you know, it begins to grow. And I've had clients refer to as a cancer. So how do we get rid of the cancer? Because it's so widespread, we can't cut it all out. We can't fire all the people we suspect because it shut down our operation, right? So just off the top of it, John, those are some tactics that we've seen.
That's
and again,
great.
apologies for the background information noise, but
along the same lines of infiltration, one of the tactics that I've seen, and be curious to see if you've also seen this, is in many countries, the IT experts, the local IT experts who tend to work on big corporate client projects came out of they cut their teeth, if you like, early in their careers, working for intelligence services in the national government. So they're the best and the brightest in the IT space. And eventually they become consultants and they work for organizations like mine. And sometimes they're compromised. They're compromised usually in pursuit of money. But by allowing them to get into your IT system on the ground at the mine and building back doors, they can gain sight of, first of all, sometimes local governments use them just to keep track of what the mine is actually producing versus what it reports to be producing, so that they make sure they get all the royalties. But also, unfortunately, they may be linked to criminal activity who want to keep an eye on when are you moving ore, when are expensive equipment coming in, things that might be sort of robbed en route. when are key personnel moving around, particularly foreign personnel who may be targeting for kidnapping, although we hear much fewer cases of that today than in the past. But nonetheless, that IT backdoor component, I think, is one that's that I've seen in a couple cases and can be really, just to save, say, a few $1,000s on those IT service fees by using local people rather than flying them in, they make themselves vulnerable. Have you seen any cases like that? You're on mute, Sam.
Yep, apologies. We worked a case in Honduras for about 18 months, and one element of that, something that we had discovered through the work that we do, because we're not IT specialists, we're just really good at developing sources and interviewing people, developing those relationships. But we learned that the IT system at the client, the system that controlled all of the financial aspects of what was going on, had been compromised directly because a young lady who worked for who worked in that department, she had been compromised, and so then she was then pulling a bunch of information, a bunch of reports, and it led back to ultimately led back to a competitor who had hired an intermediary to. So think of it as sort of a low-level corporate espionage type of activity. Yeah.
Which is not that common in mining, right? It's
not that common. No, it's not that common.
I think miners generally have a pretty good fraternity of
they do.
cooperation.
They do. So, but that's one of the only that's the only case that comes to mind, though, John. Yeah.
Okay. So you've laid out some of the tactics used by criminal organizations, be it acting alone or in concert with others.
Yeah.
What are some of the mitigation strategies that miners can use that are already in operation to deflect or to minimize some of these risks?
Yeah. So for the providers, when you have a situation where you have, depending on the size of your mining operation, you could have anywhere between, a couple dozen to a couple hundred providers for all types of different stuff. And so as those contracts are being negotiated or renegotiated, one of the questions that I have for people we work with is, who ultimately has the authority or the power to say yes or no on these contracts? Who can negotiate these contracts on behalf of the mine? And a lot of times the answer, the pushback is, oh, well, it's the GM of the mine. It's his or her. Most of the time, it's a him. So it's his, it's his purview is what he does. And so one of the things that I like to open up a discussion there is say, well, now you have in some ways not necessarily a single point of failure, but from the sort of the criminal mental aspect and looking in and saying, okay, who's an influential, important person? Of course, the GM is, but you take some of the pressure off of the GM for that contracting piece of it when you form a committee and you form a group of people who come to a consensus around, do we hire this diesel provider or that diesel provider, right? And what it does is it takes a little bit of pressure off the GM, because you can bet, especially in Mexico, where we've spent a lot of time these past couple of years, that he will be approached. And if he can honestly say, look, it's not entirely up to me, it's a committee, then you're also protecting him, you're helping keep him honest. And at the same time, you're building a little bit of resiliency into your contracting process. So that's one. The second one is when you have to work with a union, that local union boss is pretty important. And so oftentimes a local union boss will be in direct contact with the GM, with, maybe someone who's working on the social responsibility side. You may or may not have someone who's dedicated to just the labor situation at your operation, depending on the size. But that individual is, as we found, is someone who's very important to keep an eye on, very important to understand. A lot of people talk about doing relationship maps in the community. What we've come back and we've said, well, that's good that you do that. That's important. You need to understand who you're dealing with in those communities. But what about in the union? And it's not a relationship map that starts with the union representative at the top and you look at everyone below him or her. It's the opposite. where the union representative is at the bottom. And you say, okay, who does this person report to? What's going on with this union at the national level or at the state level? And then what are the pressures between this union or the next union? One of the things that we've seen in Mexico is where you can have conflict between two unions that results in some sort of work stoppage or something similar, a work slowdown at an operation. And so understanding who that union boss is and doing the necessary work to say, okay, is he or she compromised in any way? What are the relationships here? Not just the political relationships, but who else is this person involved in? And that oftentimes is work that that needs to be accomplished or needs to be completed, but isn't. And then the last thing that I'll add is going beyond the idea of saying we're going to have projects in these communities to do sustainable, different sustainable programs. We can talk all day about different, corporate social responsibility type theories and programs. I think we can all agree that keeping a positive relationship with your communities is very important. And beyond this idea of having a fairly sensitive touch or nose for how the communities feel about the mine, what's pretty important, I feel, and that I've seen is to be pretty granular when you're getting down to the aspect of what really is important for a lot of these communities, which is how is that local mine operation hiring our people from the community? Not necessarily hiring people who are at the contractor level, but at the individual level. And where we've seen some success is where they have what are called mesas de trabajo, which are these sort of round table discussions that are happening where you have maybe folks from the CSR element at the mine or other elements at the mine are meeting directly with community leaders and engaging in an ongoing conversation. Say, okay, these are the openings that we have coming up. Do you have anyone you can suggest? And so bringing them into that conversation. But we found that beyond the side of it where you're bringing them into the conversation, the other side of it is you are developing what some people may call social capital, or what I think of as relational equity with individuals, so that when these really important events come up where there's an election for a new community leader, or for in the case of maybe Mexico, or we've seen this in Chile or Brazil, when there's other political activity that's happening that people in the community are going to be posturing around or reacting towards, you're going to have that relational equity in place before that happens. So you're not sort of scrambling to try and understand what's going on at the community level. And I know there's a lot of different tactics and strategies for getting to know the communities better, but we found that the idea of a mesa de trabajo has been pretty successful for a lot of folks we've worked with.
Yeah, I think Lundin employed that really effectively in Fruta del Norte. They set up, I think, 6 or 7 of these working groups, and it was a two-way communication, right? That not only were they listening to the grievances and concerns of different actors in the local community, but they're also providing them with information to counter some of the disinformation that they were receiving from the opponents of the project. And this was crucial because even in indigenous groups that are being increasingly politicized and vociferous in Ecuador, and with good reason, have now a national structure. And what was really interesting in Fruta del Norte was at the national level, the indigenous groups were against the mine. They wanted to leverage their local people there to oppose the mine in pursuit of their national goals of negotiation with the national government. But Lundin did such a fine job in terms of really listening to the local community and finding out what is important to them. And what was really important to them was that Lundin hire local firms, service providers, food providers, etc. And they ended up shifting about 1/3 of their total procurement to local providers, which was unheard of in remote part of Ecuador. But that was enough to essentially buy goodwill and keep the local indigenous group on side in support of the project, in spite of the political pressure they were facing from their national brothers. So I think at the end of the day, it's a battle for the hearts and minds. And relying upon a local political actor or anybody else who will deliver you that support from the community is always going to be dangerous. You have to build those bridges yourself. Interesting enough, we're working on an assignment now in this age of COVID to provide an online tool for that to be facilitated, and those conversations be facilitated for the local community to take charge of sharing information and receiving feedback from the community. And you're going to see more tools like that as these communities and the mines themselves fight this PR battle for what is the truth about the impact of a mine and both the benefits and downsides of building a mine. Sam, what about investors who are looking at acquiring a mine, or looking even earlier stage at acquiring a concession and, eventually going to raise money around the stability and the future income potential of that concession, which is dependent, of course, upon a smooth operating environment. What are some of the early signs that you help people identify that might be problematic down the road, long before the mine's even built?
Yeah, well, there's that last piece is interesting. You said long before the mine is even built, because I was also thinking of some discussions I've had recently where folks have said, "Hey, we're looking at acquiring this operation over here. It's already up, it's running, so when you're going to acquire something, you're acquiring it, and for the good and the bad and the ugly, or the very ugly that may be coming with it." But on the other side of it, I've been walking with another executive in the mining world in Mexico, as he's moved from finishing his environmental impact assessment to getting ready now to break ground, to essentially getting to the point where he will be in a very physical and irreversible way, I guess, announcing his presence. When you sort of look at that eventuality in that moment, when now everybody realizes that there's going to be a mine in that particular location for a certain number of years, if you hit reverse and you go back 6 months or a year, when that conversation is happening about where the geologists are saying, okay, here's a concession, let's get the concession, that conversation for me is interesting, because oftentimes the focus is on the richness of the vein. It's a geological / scientific / financial modeling decision-making process. And a lot of times at that very early stage, there's not much of a conversation around, what does the local community look like? What are the needs of the local environment? What does the local political landscape look like? And I'm not going to advocate that, at that point in time, operators should be investing in, conducting the type of due diligence required to answer some of those questions. But I feel like a lot of times what happens is the focus on the financial aspect of it, of the raising the money, the getting the ready for construction, the huge hurdle of completing the environmental impact assessment and getting that cleared through the government, will oftentimes overshadow pretty important questions around, who these local community leaders are. So as I've seen operations getting started and getting underway, I've had conversations and I've asked questions. Do you know who the local union boss is going to be for the transport? Oh yeah, we know his name. Well, have you met with him? Do you know his connections? And so what happens is they've already gotten a halfway or 2/3 of the way down the line, and having to make that commitment with that individual without having done any work to get to know who they are. You'll probably think, and I would agree with you, that sometimes the pushback here is, I'm operating a mine in the middle of nowhere. I don't really have an option, and that's true. You may only have one transport union company to work with, or maybe you only have one windy road and you're going to fire your plant with natural gas, and that's the only way in or the only way out of the mine. And that's fine. It may not be ideal, but it's something that you're willing to put up with. And so, for me, that part of the conversation gets into, well, let's go into the situation with your eyes wide open. Have you looked at the gas companies that you're going to be working with? Have you looked at how oftentimes there's maybe been an ambush on this road, or something even more simple but altogether more compromising at times is, is this road prone to mudslides? Is it gonna be shut down for you certain times of the year when you really need natural gas? The other side of it, when we are talking to folks who say, okay, we are looking at acquiring, sort of we're a junior miner looking to grow up a little bit. We want to acquire this operating asset over here. We've been talking to people in Vancouver about it. It looks great on paper. I don't want to use the word comical, but there have been so many times, and I think some people on the call may agree with me, where that whole sense of it looks great on paper is really the only thing that people need to make the next step forward. They don't take the time to look at what that local environment is, specifically concerning who the individuals are. Who's been the security manager at the mine? Who's been the operations manager? As I was mentioning before, if a union's involved, who's that? Who are the community leaders? What is that baggage? And I was just in a conversation in May, and this is a job we didn't win. I think we probably bid at a cost that was too high for the potential client, but they said, yeah, we're looking at buying this operating mine in Mexico. And I went through all of those questions in our proposal. I said, we're going to look at these 8 key individuals, because they were talking about buying the asset and not changing out anyone. And then also saying, well, we're really risk adverse. I'm like, okay, well, if you're risk adverse, then you need to spend the money. It can be with me, or we can be with, John or colleague Nick Copeland, who's also in this line of work. But find somebody who's gonna do a good scrub on these folks. And so those two things, John, for me are what come to mind when people talk about acquiring assets or looking at new concessions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, I'm not here to upend the entire industry, but there is a built-in, if you like, conflict of interest, or a built-in vulnerability to the whole financing of mining, in that most financiers, every time they're looking at loaning money to a miner, are in a competing environment. Often 5 or 6 others are willing to lend money. Today, with the cost of capital as cheap as it is, and cost of precious metals as high as it is, the lending market is even more competitive than ever. And so the additional cost of looking at social governance issues, security issues, acceptance of the mine by the local community, these issues, everyone's aware that they're problematic, and they can be problematic in 6 months or in 5 years or even 10 years further down. But the funding of that additional due diligence is something that ultimately gets passed on to the miner. So it's up to the miner to say, well, you know what? Yeah, we're willing to fund that in order to get the money. But if out of the 7 lenders who are setting their terms for the loan, 1 or 2 of them don't require that, and there's no regulation requiring it, then too often they'll just, don't worry about it, and they'll go ahead and fund the mine. But the reality is that a lot of the risk models that are used in the pre-investment due diligence process today are still built on this notion of national investment risk, that this country is better than that country, when in reality, the risk paradigm shifted now 6 years ago from a national level to a local level. So unless you are looking at risk at a local level, you're simply missing out on 80% of the risk elements in a mining investment proposition. So with that, I want to invite our guests to ask questions. I'm going to give you 2 options. You can write your questions in the chat and we'll field them, or you can raise your hand. And again, in the participants section of the Zoom, it's on the bottom panel. you will see the ability under your name to raise your hand. And if you do that, I will call out your name and ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead and pose your questions. In the meantime, I am going to take just a 30-second commercial break here and tell you about a risk symposium. As you know, most of our webinars and certainly all of our mining chats are free. But from time to time, we do a paid service webinars, particularly when we bring in an assortment of guests, speakers, and or we do an extended period. And on November 12th, we're going to run a risk symposium. And we're going to do a deep dive on the risk environment in about 10 countries in Latin America, looking specifically at political risk, but also security issues. And then we're going to do a deep dive on what it means for miners and what it means for energy investors in those areas. And in some markets, we'll look at other sectors as well, but it'll be principally those two sectors. I'm going to, in the chat mode, I'm going to put in the registration link. Like I say, there is a cost associated with this, but it's a 4-hour event. We will publish the schedule and the countries we'll be addressing, so you can tune in and tune out depending on the countries that are of interest to you. And certainly we hope this will be of interest. So I've just posted the link to register for that. Check it out. See if it's something that is of interest to you. So at this point, please, again, I want to invite your questions in the chat or ask you to raise your hand. So I'm looking on our participant level. I see everybody very respectfully in mute. We do have one question. Nick, go ahead and either chat your question or unmute yourself and tell us your question.
Good day, John, Sam, good to see you. My question would be, we've obviously discussed the organized criminal element, which is clearly a key element of risk. How about affiliated groups that are out there? What's your experience with, say, small-scale mining or even illicit mining groups who, particularly related to, say, a consulta popular, may see the development of a larger scale mine as a threat to their interests and band together, perhaps with NGOs, with an axe to grind on the environmental side to try and subvert a consulta popular away from purely just a community response?
Sam, you want to take that on?
Yeah, hey Nick, good to see you, buddy. A couple of things come to mind. We looked at an issue in northern Chile where water is a big deal, and the group that had come together to start working against the mine, against the operator, was this interesting connection between a lawyer, someone, a worker or employee at the mine, and a community leader. And they had actually done just that, Nick. They had gotten in with the police and the judicial side of the local community on sort of the Chilean government side. And then on the community side, which is more of an indigenous, traditional governance system, they had enacted a sort of a consulta popular to bring a grievance against the operator concerning the mismanagement of a water rights agreement. And through that, we're able to put the operator in a pretty difficult position where ultimately they had to negotiate a payout. And that was their whole plan. And then when the payout happened, the community got a very small amount of it. And the people who had, come together to make that happen, were the ones who were driving around in nice cars in Santiago a couple of years later, right? So we've seen that. And I imagine it probably happens more often than we're aware. I mean, for us, that was a 9-month investigation that took us to the point where we could confidently report on what had actually happened, right? The other one that comes to mind is a term that I've recently learned in Mexico, which is lupios, which is this idea of illegal miners. And what we found is is in some ways they are what's been described to me as a nuisance. So, when you have fairly untrained and poorly equipped illegal miners who are crawling around underground at a shuttered mine site to try and mop up anything that's left underground, and then they suffocate, well, that becomes a problem for the concession holder, doesn't it? But then we've also found where groups of lupios are coming together, and they're pulling enough ore out of the ground where they're able to feed what we've discovered to be illicit or clandestine processing operations in different parts of Mexico. And this is an interesting conversation, because you say, well, you have people, the miners will say, well, we have people stealing ore from us. And so my first question is, well, who's the fence? Who's the one making that market for you? And so you get into the situation where you have, an initial group of lupios who then band together to create this processing plant, this, old claptrap of a processing plant that can actually, turn into something valuable. And then that in turn attracts more people who are unemployed to start going underground and pulling more ore out of the ground. And that's actually become I would say a significant problem for some of the operations we're familiar with in Mexico, where rather than, like a blockade situation being, a shot to the head, this is more like death by 1,000 cuts type of situation, where you just can't focus on what you need to do because you're constantly dealing with this nuisance of, like a swarm of mosquitoes around your head, preventing you from seeing where you're walking. So we've also seen that. Those are the good points, Nick. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think it's really important to not paint illegal or informal or artisanal miners with one stroke, because they really do vary in nature, both in their tensions, their ability to be a threat, and even to change or to influence the national thinking on mining. Colombia is a great example. Colombia geologically is a very attractive jurisdiction, but 90% of gold mining in Colombia has traditionally been taken on by informal or illegal miners. And some of those groups have been closely associated with criminal groups that launder money. And so in the minds of many urban Colombians, gold mining equals money laundering for illicit groups. And it has been an upward battle for many legitimate gold miners to earn the support of governments for their operations, because the public opinion of gold mining is so negative. You go to Guyana, and pork knockers or informal miners are part of the national, they're a legend in the sort of national fabric of society. And if you come from a low-income Afro-Guyanese background, one of the rites of passage, one of the ways to make it, is to go into the bush and pan for gold. And it's a very innocuous style of mining. It's usually done just a couple of feet under the ground by the riverside, but it's toxic. It's they use old-fashioned chemicals that denigrate the quality of the water and also stain the reputation of the industry. But they are not they're not organized and criminal in the same way that they are in other parts. And still others, informal miners, may be incredibly important to at least not driving them out of business, but cooperating them can be incredibly important to winning hearts and minds in a local community, because those hundreds of miners may support thousands of people through their households and local vendors. And at the end of the day, their ability to impinge upon your own output as an industrial miner is pretty minor. They're more of a reputational risk in terms of the labor practices, environmental practices. So some miners have successfully worked with them and said, look, we'll let you continue to mine even though you're on our concession, so long as you follow labor practices, environmental practices that aren't going to get any of us into trouble. We'll buy the gold off you, and we'll help you bring it to market. And so they legitimize their operations. They keep them employed. They keep the community supportive of mining in general. So you've really got to drill down another step and understand who you're dealing with. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, both Nick and Sam here, but this is more for the wider audience on the call today. Nick, any follow-up to that?
You're absolutely right about the importance of very carefully unpacking the historical rights and traditions of small-scale mining. And we were in Suriname in March this year and did exactly that. And it was a fascinating process of understanding traditional authority rights, where actually, as you say, in this case, they were not illegal. They were actually just not regulated and formalized. And the government even signed a peace accord saying that that would happen, but never followed through on the promise. And so there's always another or multiple layers to get through and understand, so that the full risk and opportunity picture can be laid out. And I think, going to your due diligence point, that's both a risk and an opportunity. There will be points around acquisition, perhaps of a junior miner operation, where by using the likes of AMI and others to understand better the picture, one can actually bring negotiation points to the table as you uncover points or issues to negotiate on. Or on the junior miner side, by working proactively ahead of time in that pre-feasibility stage, they can help resolve issues and actually raise the value or perceived net present value of the operation by showing that they've done their homework on these above ground risk issues correctly, and that they have the social license to operate. And I think with ESG concerns just growing ever more, we saw Ernst & Young's annual report showing that social license to operate continues to be the #1 challenge according to their survey. That is going to be questions that are going to be ever more asked of mining in the region by investors, by all parties to actions, because they're learning that those above ground risks can actually become very costly and damaging for the commercial success of operations. So this is ever more crucial to get right.
Right. Thanks, Nick. We've got Donald Sisk on the line, and Donald's always very active participant in these chats. Donald, you had a very specific question. Do you want to go ahead and provide a little context? Go ahead and unmute yourself, provide a little context to the question, and maybe Sam and I can tackle it.
Hi, guys. How are you? Thanks. I appreciate it. There's a company out there that has been accused of purchasing gold and refining it for another country, and the gold was supposed to be originated in Venezuela. And I know that they couldn't have done it because they would have put them well over their capacity, and they wouldn't have been able to process any of my material. So is there a way to go about doing due diligence to clean that up, to show that the company didn't have anything to do with Venezuela? Because right now that can really harm a company.
Sam, any thoughts on that?
Hi, Donald. Thank you for the question. I'm just trying to understand the context of the question a little bit more. To mirror it back to you, what I heard you say was that that a company has been accused of, it sounds like some sort of maybe a government body or regulatory body of illegally processing Venezuelan gold, and maybe from there exporting it. Is that what I heard? Did I hear that correctly?
Is this a sanctions issue?
Correct. Sorry, with the sanctions, that would make it illegal.
Got you. Okay. Yeah, that's a tough one. It makes me also think of the Kimberley process with diamonds and Venezuelan diamonds that for the longest time were illegally exported through Guyana. Something that I looked at years ago. My first question is, what's behind the accusation? Are they really concerned about sanctions busting, or is there something else behind it? That would be a question that comes to mind. The second one is, who is your plant manager? Who was the person who would have been there to oversee that process? And I don't know exactly, what that input process for you looks like, but do you have a CCTV system or some other camera system that would see, the introduction of ore coming from a different route? That's something that comes to mind. And then conducting, deep interviews with the right people who would have been there at different points in time, and pulling all of that information together in a way to present your case seems like one step forward. Without knowing exactly some of the more details. Those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Is this company a smelter who's accused of sourcing raw ore from Venezuela, or actually sourcing smelted?
Well, they're not being accused of smelting, of going to Venezuela and getting. Somebody apparently, like I can bring gold to any refinery, right. And apparently they're saying that somebody brought Venezuelan gold to this refinery. And it's the big issue. It's not so much a financial thing. It's in a part of the world where things like this really shouldn't matter that much. But the fact of the matter is, it does block them from getting the LBMA status. Things like that within the gold industry that do matter.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like if you were to do the work on it, because depending on where that ore is coming from, I'm thinking the refineries either in northern Brazil or in eastern Colombia. There's got to be border crossings that are happening. There's got to be, depending on the amount of material, you got to have a fairly large presence of moving earth from point A to point B. And if you've got that, then you could also pick up on those breadcrumbs.
Well, and you probably have to prove that if they claim it's not coming from Venezuela, unfortunately the burden of proof is on them, right? Under a sanctions environment, you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. That's how.
That's America.
Work. Well, yeah, it's not just America. It's how sanctions work. It's a reversal of the the legal system. But you almost have to reverse engineer your supply chain and demonstrate through invoicing and through manifests of the movement of the gold that it came from from a non-Venezuelan source. Unfortunately, the reality is that with so much gold being mined illegally or informally between Colombia, Venezuela, the Guyanas, Ecuador, that part of the world has, when it comes to gold, it's anywhere from 70 to 100% is illegal and informally mined. And so if you are legitimately sourcing it from another jurisdiction, you're probably still sourcing it from, at one point or another, informal or illegal miners. And so that becomes a whole nother level of challenge in terms of getting a paper trail behind that. Because the fact is that, you talk to smelters who've set up operations in Peru, most of their customers are informal miners. So it's not going to be easy, but that's what you got to do. You have to prove your innocence, unfortunately, in this case. Donald, I want to move on to a question from Patricia Fortier. Appreciate it, Donald. Going back to this notion of people being compromised, Sam, you spoke about people being compromised inside an organization, but we also know, and Patricia's pointed out, that local government officials may be compromised. I've certainly seen this, again, related to illegal miners, where organized illegal miners basically pay off the local mayor to oppose an industrial mine because it threatens their business. So certainly local government officials particularly can be compromised. How do you deal with that as a miner?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of some relevant examples that we're looking at right now, in Mexico, where we have elections coming up next year. And as the political cycle goes in Mexico, a lot of the pre-candidates, as they call them, are beginning to surface and take some position. And one of the interesting aspects there is when you have a mine operation in a certain municipality, that immediate local politician you need to pay attention to is the person who's the, as they say in Mexico, the municipal president, and who that person is. And the second level or layer is the state representative who's in that area, and then the third layer is the federal representative who's in that area, who would oversee that district that you're in. So those are the three that we're always looking at. Generally speaking, the legislative side of it, so your representatives are less influential and oftentimes are less likely to be compromised. It's that municipal president that we see oftentimes causing the most amount of trouble. So I'll just speak to that political position. We could also, in some cases, even go up to the governor. A couple of governors come to mind, but just to focus on that local municipal president, the first thing is just to understand how that individual is compromised, and the extent to which the compromise is something that is under duress or is complicit. We've seen in some areas both, and the second thing that comes to mind is, once you understand sort of the nature of the compromise and how that individual is dealing with that criminal element that's controlling them, then you also have to understand and sort of take this position of being a pretty important element, politically speaking, for that individual, because more often than not, you're going to be a significant source of employment. You're going to be a significant piece of the economic engine of that municipality, or depending on where you are, you could be the only economic engine. You can be the only resource for like a canasta básica type of relief program, or some sort of healthcare mobile health clinic program, or something like that. So I think when I've advised mining operators on how to deal with that local element that's been compromised, I say, look, you have to sit down with the person, you have to talk to them, you have to have a relationship with them. But you don't have to bend and bow to their to their wishes or their desires, and especially if the relationship is new. Oftentimes, I've seen in Mexico, in Brazil, in Guatemala, that the initial meeting or the first couple of meetings is not always about saying, "Hey, you've got to pay me this amount a month, or we're going to trash your assets, or we're going to cause trouble." It's more about a sort of a feeling it out and figuring out who's gonna make the first move. And I think a wise choice or a wise consideration is to go in with a strategic plan for how are you going to engage with that person to make him or her look better from a political point of view. How are you going to engage that person to provide something that, depending on where in Latin America we're talking, or even in the United States, support them for constituent service. And if you can go in with a fairly well-reasoned and financed strategy, I find that oftentimes is going to be a pretty strong bulwark against anything that they may bring back in your direction. And indeed, I think apart from a situation, an unfortunate or ugly situation you may find yourself in, where extortion is a serious problem, or maybe they're holding your transport trucks for ransom. I've seen that too. What's more likely than not to happen is that, because of that municipal president's involvement with local organized crime, the municipality that you're in, or certain sections of it, may become sort of off and on again. I don't want to use the word battlegrounds, but that's sort of coming to mind for strife, for friction, for flare-ups between criminal groups. We've seen that in Mexico. I've seen it in areas in Brazil where it manifests itself more, and suddenly highways are more dangerous than they used to be because of land pirates, we call them in Brazil. Or you might have a rival criminal element coming in just to throw a bunch of money around and basically pay a local community to get fired up. And so we've seen some of that. And so those are some of the things that you also have to keep in mind when there is a local political influence or a leader that's been compromised. Just some thoughts that come to mind. John?
Right. Thank you, Sam. Look, there's no question that we could go on for a long time, but we do promise to keep this to an hour, and we've reached that hour. I want to take this time to thank you, Sam. It's always fascinating to chat with you, and look forward to more opportunities working with you. I want to remind us all, and again, I've posted this in the chat. There's a link there to the symposium that we're running on November 12th. It'll be about a 4-hour event. We'll delve into the risk environment specific to 10 different jurisdictions, and then comment on it from a mining perspective and from an energy perspective, if it's relevant. We'll have about 6 or 7 guest speakers, all of them experts in the field of risk, and as well as security issues. So we invite you to that. We're very excited about it. We've all been waiting to go back to live conferences, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen as soon as we would like. So this will be an online event, but the quality of the speakers that we'll be having, the breadth of geographies that we'll be covering, I think will make it a unique event. We look forward to your participation there. We will be continuing our mining coffee chats the first Tuesday of every month. So stay tuned for our next announcement for that in November. And thank you again for participating today, everyone. Hope it was of use to everybody, and we look forward to the next one. Thanks so much.